Okay, I'm just going to see if I can get all the panelists gathered around just so I can introduce everybody. I think there's it's going to be a bit of a squash. So I'm Becky Cox from Living Streets. I'm Principal Technical Advisor, so I've sort of put this webinar together here. Here is my esteemed panel, so I will let them introduce themselves.
Hi, Adrian Lord from Filter Institute, John Dales from Lumen, and Ashley.
Great. Okay. So you'll get all of those back a little bit later in the webinar. So the idea of today was just to have a webinar focused a little bit more on the walking side of the LCWIP programme. I think probably you'll all be at different stages in terms of how far through you are, and some of you will be well into your stage 4 walking analysis, even on stage 5 or 6, and others will be a bit earlier on in the programme. So hopefully this will be helpful whatever stage you're at. So we're going to what's the note saying? Couldn't hear the panelists. Hopefully when they're sitting a little bit closer to the microphone, we should be able to hear everybody later. So yeah, the overview of today is just I'll give a brief sort of introduction, an overview to the topic and some of the background. I'm going to hand over to Adrian. He's going to talk a little bit more about the actual the outputs from the stage 4 analysis. Adrian's been working with the technical support team. And then over, I think, to Ashley, who will talk a little bit about sort of taking analytical approaches to walking, using GIS tools to provide walking networks. And then also lastly over to John, who is going to talk a little bit more about the general walking infrastructure, how we design that and how we install it and that sort of thing. Okay, so hopefully, hopefully everybody can see those slides now. So what I really want to talk a bit about just in this introductory session is how I think we have an idea of what we think infrastructure is, and perhaps what cycling infrastructure is, what walking infrastructure is, but how do we perhaps think beyond that to cover something a little bit more broader in keeping with the LCWIP guidance. And then, as I say, Adrian is going to talk a little bit about the recommendations made through the LCWIP programme, through the technical support, and then we'll look at some specific infrastructure examples. So I think perhaps in keeping with some of the feedback that we've been receiving through the strategic support side of the LCWIP programme, kind of what seems to be coming out of the stage 5 analysis, certainly, maybe the latter end of stage 4, is that actually the walking elements of the LCWIP are quite difficult to plan for. There's perhaps guidance out there for the cycling side, and there's tools in place for that, but the walking side has got more perhaps technical requirements to it, or it needs a different level of thinking that we haven't captured so much so far. So I've posed these 2 questions: why is walking so difficult to plan for, and why does walking appear to be so difficult to plan for? Because I'm hoping by the end of today that we might have demystified a little bit of this. So looking at the LCWIP guidance itself, hopefully you'll all be familiar with this, but so the stage 4, the key parts of that are looking at the methodology for analysing the routes, analysing your core walking zones, analysing the connecting routes into those. Then also the auditing stage, with the key tool as part of that being the walking route audit tool. I do not want this, there we go. And then going on to stage 5, this is the sort of prioritisation tool, prioritisation stage, sorry, and this is a stage I think quite a lot of the Tranche 1 authorities are just starting to get to. And again, there's been some questions raised about how you do that prioritisation process for walking as opposed to cycling or alongside cycling. So looking at the guidance, the stage summary for the 4th stage, it recommends these steps for mapping a future walking network and identifying infrastructure improvements. So the guidance suggests identifying clustering for origin destination points, establishing walking routes and core walking zones, and auditing the main routes and identifying those barriers. The outputs from this stage should be proposed future walking network map, and also this programme of walking infrastructure improvements. What I think is interesting about this, if we look at point 6.3, where the routes and zones identified on the map are not of a sufficient quality to meet the needs of people who would wish to travel by foot, a programme of walking infrastructure improvements will need to be identified. And I wonder how we understand this question of what is insufficient quality to meet the needs of people who wish to travel by foot. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that now, how we might gauge what is sufficient and insufficient quality. So yeah, what is walking infrastructure? These are the sort of things I think that we might understand as walking infrastructure. Things like footways, crossings, different types of crossings, tactile, dropped curbs, that sort of thing. This is maybe a relatively basic level of walking infrastructure, but it is the absolutely fundamental blocks of creating walkable places. But just moving on a little bit from that to think about perhaps the broader picture. There was a report in 2011 from Lancaster, Leeds and Oxford Brookes universities, and they did a bit of qualitative research into trying to understand what the barriers were to people walking. Because effectively what we're doing in this programme is saying, why aren't people walking more? What can we do to improve the walking experience for people? So I think there's an importance there to think about what the barriers are. So the main elements that came out of this research were around fears around physical safety. So that's fear both of other people, of your own personal safety, but also of physical injury, injuring yourself, tripping over a curbstone or falling into the road and that kind of thing. The discomfort element, being exposed to the elements, this perception of abnormality, which I think is an interesting point. This idea that other people don't walk, so why would I? And then complex family routines, just not being able to fit it into the day. There we go. Just to follow up on that, we, Living Streets, do community street audits where we take groups of people out to look at the walking environment and to understand a little bit about what works and what doesn't work. One of the main things that comes out of those audits, this is an example from one we did recently in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Again, safety and perception of crime were absolutely at the top of the list of things that people felt were barriers to walking. That completely changed their experience of walking, followed by the physical state of the street, fly tipping, rubbish. Then slightly further down the list, interestingly, this whole element of what is there to walk to. And another part of what we need to think of, I think, in terms of walking and walking infrastructure is, are there suitable facilities and suitable attractors to make sure that people actually want to walk, and are those within walkable distance? And then right down at the bottom of this list actually was things to do with the physical street. So you can see the sort of order of priority in terms of people's perceptions of space. So I think from my understanding of this, I would like to propose that we think of this in terms of 3 different levels of infrastructure. There's what I would call the sort of micro infrastructure, which is the fine detail, things like crossings, dropped curbs, footways, tactiles, desire lines, that sort of thing. There's then another stage, which I think is what I would call the macro stage of planning. So this is thinking about networks and connectivity. This is the sort of approach that the LCWIP guidance takes, which is why I think it is a good approach to have. It's thinking about walking as a transport mode. So thinking about it as needing a network, thinking about needing to connect places, even if they're slightly further away in terms of distance, thinking that at any given point people might be walking along that network, and hopefully guarding against the sort of piecemeal approach of ending up with kind of one public realm improvement scheme here and another public realm improvement scheme over here, but not necessarily connecting them up. There's then a third stage, which I would propose is what I would term emotional infrastructure. But really what I mean by this is understanding talking about those barriers, talking about that fear, that perception of why people don't feel like they can go out and walk easily. How do we understand that in terms of infrastructure that can mitigate for those perceptions? So how do we understand how lighting, for instance, can make people feel safer? How can wayfinding help people to understand a place and to feel like it's, to break it down into the sort of size that people feel they can walk around? I think there's a little bit as well about conflict management in here between modes. So particularly, I guess, around shared use paths. You know, it's brilliant that we've got increased rates of cycling. That's fantastic to see. And well managed and well engineered cycle infrastructure should, you know, it should be positive for pedestrians. But I think if you're not careful with that, you can end up with an issue where cycling infrastructure comes at the cost of pedestrian amenity. So there's a bit to think about around that. And then even down to the timings on crossings, a lot of the audit work that we do, one of the main things we pick up is how long, say you've got a 2 or 3 stage crossing to get across a main road, that can, in terms of the perception of that, that can make a big difference. Whereas if you can make single stage crossings, if you can make them wide, if you can make them suitable for everybody, you know, walking at all different speeds to get across, then that does change the perception of space. So again, looking at the LCWIP guidance, it's actually pretty comprehensive in terms of recognising that walking infrastructure beyond, you know, simply looking at the width of the footway. You know, it's got things like talking about CCTV, security cameras, improved street lighting, removing the street clutter, and then things like seating facilities, general improvements to the public realm. So these are all things beyond what we might traditionally think of as walking infrastructure, but important to understand why these things come under the realm of walking and why they could, you know, potentially encourage more people to walk. So just briefly by way of example, this is just a photo of Leeds city centre, but it could be anywhere really, any pedestrianised city centre, and just applying that sort of wider thinking in the urban context. Other things that we might actually recognise as walking infrastructure in here, so you've got the footway, you've got the surface, but things like bins, seating, what I'd call these sort of human infrastructures, you know, things that tell people all the time, street lighting, cycle racks, actually, I think plausibly could go under walking infrastructure because well-managed cycle parking will help with pedestrian amenity. So yeah, there's all sorts of things in the urban realm that go beyond perhaps our traditional understanding of walking infrastructure. Essential to understand this perception, and I think there's probably more work to be done around that, but it's, you know, I think it's a good building block. And then to understand that cycle infrastructure, as I say, won't automatically cater for walking. I think you do need to be designing with both modes in mind from the outset. And obviously the beauty of the LCWIP is that you have got those 2 modes being considered alongside each other. So hopefully, you know, a good opportunity to think about how they fit together. So hopefully now I'm going to hand over to Adrian, except, yeah, actually I should have said that at the beginning. Oh dear. Okay, some people are saying that the slides haven't been changing for them. This, I should say, this webinar is going to go up on YouTube after we've delivered it. So hopefully, if you can hear the audio now at least, then we'll be able to catch up the slides afterwards. I will try and make that work better then. Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got questions, we'll take a couple of questions at the end of each speaker, and then we'll take a few more questions at the end of the webinar. So if anybody's got a question now, while I try and faff around to try and make these slides display, then feel free to, if you ask it as a question, a text question, then we will try and respond. By the end of this webinar, we're going to be completely sorted. Yes, I think we had one question there. Let me just go back. Sorry, I just lost the question in the middle of me asking about slides. Where is it? Yeah, the question, how do you balance existing well-used routes with those routes that are poorly used but have potential? And I'm going to invite my fellow panellists into these questions as well. Yeah, I think, obviously, I think part of the LCWIP process is about that prioritisation of routes. It's about looking at where it is important to understand where people are currently moving and which routes they're currently using, but also I think particularly perhaps for cycling, there's maybe slightly more scope for using routes that might be a little bit slightly less direct, but much more pleasant routes. I think with the walking side, people, well, I always say that people are a little bit like drops of water falling down a mountainside. You know, they tend to take the route of least resistance. So that's why you see people jumping over, you know, crash barriers in the middle of dual carriageways and things like that, you know, when there could have been a slightly nicer route, but it's a bit longer. So I think probably my take on this would be it's important to always look at the most direct routes, certainly for walking. Yes, if you've got routes that are, I suppose if you've got routes that are poorly used but have potential, but the, you know, if it's a perceptual barrier, if it's, you know, if they're perceived as being unsafe for any reason, that's when you can really, you know, drill down into the detail of how people are, you know, are perceiving that space, I suppose. And that's when you can look at things like, is it street lighting that would make the difference? Is it CCTV? Is it just trying to open the route out a little bit? Is it even just things like wayfinding, saying, yes, this is a connecting route, this does go, you know, through to your destination and where you need to get to. Maybe some sort of softer measures like that are a good way to look at potential routes. But I think probably my starting point would be understanding where people are currently moving, and unless it's some, you know, unless it's a route that is obviously completely blocked for some reason, you know, if it's something that's severed by a dual carriageway or something like that, then obviously yes, you might want to look at other routes. My fellow panelists may have more to say on that later on. Okay, so I am going to hand over to Adrian.
Hi, good morning. I'm just going to go through the process of essentially stage 4 of the LCWIP process. Oops, if I can get the slide to work. And we say it's a 6-stage process, but really that we came about that by kind of deconstructing all the things that you need to do to create walking and cycling infrastructure. And of course, we recognise that it's not necessarily sequential, you complete stage 1 and then go on to stage 2 and so on and so forth, that a lot of these things happen at once and in conjunction with each other, and that they're all related. And so I just wanted to say that, because I know the way in which some of the support is being given is very much kind of, oh, well, you do stage 3 and then we'll do stage 4 and so on. But I think where it's working well, it's working because people are just kind of getting on with it and allocating and sharing tasks between one another. And I want to question, the toolkit for walking is very sparse at the moment. When we did the original guidance, we just couldn't really find very much. You know, there's quite a bit of research on things like the economic benefits of walking. There is the old IHT guidance on kind of how to design for walking, and it's got some planning elements in, particularly around sort of new development, but there wasn't really that much around. And so at the moment, this toolkit is sparse. One of the objects of the current support program is to try to fill that out, and we're going on to a meeting with DFT later this afternoon to consider where the gaps are and how and best we might start to fill some of those gaps in the design guidance side of things. And just to reiterate what Becky said, ideally at the end of the process you end up with a network plan of some description, a prioritised list of improvements, and a summary report that sets in context the schemes that you've come up with as part of your LCWIP. One thing that we have been keen to try and emphasise throughout the LCWIP process is to treat walking and cycling in the way in which we treat other modes of transport, in that we, rather than looking at what's there and where opportunities are on the supply side of things, we try to cater for demand, because really what we are trying to do through the LCWIP process is get people to change behaviour and to make short journeys by active modes. In order to do that, we need to understand where those short journeys are taking place and what kind of trips people are making, and therefore which trips could we potentially target through some of the infrastructure. And we know that lots of people are making short trips less than 2 miles in length, but what we don't often know is exactly where they're going and the type of trips and who they are and how many people are doing that kind of trip. And again, the data is quite sparse. You know, we're still by and large relying on census journey to work data. There have been other data sets available to us through some of the local authorities. So we've been looking at travel to school data. We've been looking at other sort of data that people collect in annual travel surveys and so on. So we have been kind of looking at how best to use all of that data and come up with essentially a network plan based around data. But quite often that network plan is also just based around local knowledge and what people are able to provide in terms of their own local knowledge about what people are doing. We generally start by looking at core walking zones and trying to identify those. And all the core walking zone is, we just identified the fact that most walking and cycling trips happen in places where there is a density of attractors, trip generators of some description. And that might include densities of origins as well. So particularly with a number of local authorities, we've been looking at where they've got housing growth plans, because that will obviously affect the origin side of things as well as the destinations. And one thing to consider is that this whole process we were asked to do by DFT right at the outset, to create something that was scalable, so that some people might be looking at a regional LCWIP, others might be looking at a town-wide one, or even a district within a town. And so you can apply that logic to different scales of trip generators and just look at where they are accumulating and look at how you get to and from those core areas. In general, in most places, we're working with a kind of buffer area of around 2 kilometres, which equates to around a 20-minute walk. And there's been loads and loads of research from around the world which suggests that the average commute time for regular commuters is about 20 minutes to 30 minutes. It grows slightly for larger cities, but by and large, people will move house over time so that they don't spend much more than sort of 30 minutes commuting. And so we thought that's a fair estimate of regular trip journeys. It also coincides with things from National Travel Survey and so on. And you can either look at that just in the purely geographical terms, or if you've got the time and the ability, and you can put it in GIS and log it as actual travel times, so that you don't get just a perfect circle, but you actually get a isochrone based on the actual routes that people have available to them. And this on the screen now, just a typical example. This is one that WSP did up in the northeast in a smallish town. So the red are the kind of core walking zone areas, and then the blue are all the feeder routes that are within that kind of 2 kilometre buffer of that town. Once you've done that, you can start to develop your network plan. And again, in smaller towns, it is usually fairly self-evident that there are some key corridors, which usually also the main road corridors, onto which people naturally gravitate because they form the most direct routes into a town centre. And quite often, if it's a high street in a sort of traditional linear sort of town centre, then that that is also the kind of basis of the core walking zone, that is the central street within the core walking zone. Once you move away from those, on the diagram here, those primary walking routes are shown in green. There are also kind of secondary walking routes, which are essentially the sort of distributor walking routes that gather people from all of the sort of cul-de-sacs and access roads onto sort of the key connecting routes within that area. And they may also serve kind of locally important attractors such as schools, colleges, business parks and so on, but they are not necessarily part of these core walking zones. So those are the ones that are shown in blue. So you start to establish essentially a three-tier hierarchy of routes, of kind of main routes, these feeder routes, and then everything else is the kind of access routes that just provide local access. What we've found is that in larger cities, it doesn't work quite so neatly as it does on that diagram, because you have different kind of sub-regions within the city centre. So you might have an entertainment quarter, you might have a civic and cultural quarter. You've got usually 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 railway stations that are significant, or tram stations that are significant attractors within themselves. And so you end up with quite a complex pattern within city centres, and you essentially often end up with a kind of multi-centred approach. And looking at some of the core routes between those is a bit more sophisticated. So I've been working with TFGM and 1, 2 of the other bigger cities to sort of look at how we disentangle some of that. And a lot of it is done really by observation, by looking at where are the main shopping streets, and then you'll quite often get a kind of secondary street, which is quite often the street which has got kind of smaller independent shops, bars and so on which form these kind of secondary routes through the city centre. And then you will get still get sort of quiet connecting streets, which have usually got sort of more blank frontage and offices, car parks and so on which are less important routes. So, but it is, again, it is a more iterative process. It's not something that you can easily do through just data analysis. This is just a case study from work that WSP did in Essex. And they simply used the lower super output areas. They plotted on the centroids of each of those lower super output areas, used the census journey to work data and some other local data to plot trips between those. The dark area in middle is the core walking zone, and then the other areas are within that sort of 2 kilometres. That was then very importantly ratified through the sort of consultation with officers and involvement of officers to look at where those kind of lines that the data analysis throws up between origins and destinations actually occur on the ground on routes. And into that analysis, we also added new development sites with 100+ dwellings, so significant developments that may add in more trips to the network and so on. Ashley is here from Living Streets, and he's going to talk about the walkability tool later, but what happened in Essex was when they applied the walkability tool after this sort of data-led exercise had been done, the two happily married up quite well. So it looked like it helped to validate that the walkability tool was matching up to what the officers felt instinctively was happening on the ground. Some important factors of how that process in Essex worked well. They'd already put some time into developing local walking, cycling strategies, so they weren't really starting from scratch. and it was linked to a master planning process that was already starting to take account of some of the housing growth areas and the employment growth projections, and looking at how existing infrastructure can cope with that, and how and what and where new infrastructure is likely to be needed. And it helped enormously that the local officers and other key stakeholders are very familiar with their patch, and so they understood the sort of context for the local walking behaviours, and they've been working for a number of years with sort of local stakeholders in a local travel plan club with businesses and with bikeability training and lots of other sort of wraparound encouragement and education measures. So they had a good feel for what travel behaviours were happening locally and where they could make a difference. And it's important that this kind of infrastructure is always related back to some of the encouragement and policy measures as well. And once you've done that kind of planning exercise to identify the potential routes, the route audit is really about looking at how you identify the potential improvements. And the route audit guidance that's within the LCWIP guidance is based on the design guidance principles. So safe, comfortable, attractive, coherent, and so on. And what are the physical attributes that make up each of those principles? We've been using this across a number of local authorities now, and it's also been running for quite a few years in Wales, and I've just been in the process of updating the Welsh guidance. And there's been some feedback saying that potentially the scoring is a bit too simplistic, and that the score itself, because it's only a sort of simple 0, 1, 2 scoring system, doesn't really allow for much differentiation between routes. And so you're relying very heavily on the comments and observations that you make alongside that simple scoring system. Some people have been sort of looking at a different scale, to look at a 5-point scale to try and get some more subtlety into their scoring system and so on, so that it becomes then easier to use those scores when you go on to do the stage 5, the prioritisation process. And I think this sort of comes back to the question we had on Becky's session. How do you select which routes to audit in larger settlements? Because when you do your kind of initial data analysis, it might throw up kind of tens or hundreds of routes. And generally, what most people have been doing is looking back at the density of attractors along those routes, the observed behaviour of where people are already going, and then what are the most direct routes? So where are the best and easiest places to get through a place? But also, are there some known issues? So one thing that the core walking zones tend to throw up is that the core walking zone is often defined by a ring road, or in Bedford's case, there is a physical barrier of the river running through the middle of the town and so on. And so some of those severance issues might be leading you towards certain solutions and certain funnel routes. And in Bedford's case, they'd done some analysis and recognised that they needed a new river crossing, and that by opening up that new river crossing, then it would open up a whole kind of street either side that formed a logical linear route. And so that for them, that made sense because they knew their patch, and they had recognised that a bridge was a solution for them. In other places, it might be tackling things like existing collision data and so on, where you know that there is a problem of severance that is in turn leading to people crossing the road in maybe hazardous locations and leading to an accident problem. When we're doing the walking route audit, things that we tend to look for are the sort of permanent issues, which are the physical constraints and the physical attributes of the route, and that might be lack of crossings and lack of drop curbs and obstructions in the footway and so on. But the walking route audit tool also picks up temporary issues, which might happen pretty much every day, but they are still kind of movable issues. So that might be parking on the footway, advertising boards in the footway, things that are just in need of maintenance and so on. And that's been another criticism of the tool, that it doesn't necessarily differentiate between the two when you're doing the scoring. And so you need to be conscious of that, thinking about, you know, which of these is a design issue, which of these is a maintenance issue, and so on, which of these is an enforcement behaviour issue. And then you need to sort of ask yourself, can these issues be addressed along the route that we've chosen? And usually the technical answer to that is yes, we can normally design something that is ideal for walking, ideal for cycling and so on. But there are lots of other things happening in the street, and does it make sense financially? Is the solution viable for the number of people that are actually walking at present and that you predict might be able to walk in the future? Does it fit in with the wider needs of the street in terms of deliveries, bus services, and all the other things that are going on? Will it be politically acceptable? And there may be some fundamental problems. I mean, this is Salford Circus, which sits beneath Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham. And when you look at how to get between Birmingham city centre and the sort of north of the city, almost all routes, including the canal towpath and a number of roads, converge on this area. But for walking and cycling, you've got to go through these horrible subways, through this big kind of cathedral-like space that is completely empty and poorly lit and has a real crime problem. And so tackling that is probably a bit beyond just a walking and cycling scheme. It needs a kind of fairly major public investment to link up the areas either side of that. But nevertheless, it's something that needs doing, and so it still needs to go onto our list. And so when you think about what you can do within the LCWIP, yes, it might be a series of really simple measures and we just add them into the list and that becomes part of the LCWIP. It may be that we decide, well, actually, this is too difficult a route to tackle on this occasion, but there is a fairly suitable alternative route, and so we can look at doing something like that in the short term. Or it may be that we say, yes, well, we do need to tackle this. It's not really just a walking and cycling issue. It's a bigger kind of land use and strategic planning solution. And so during stages 5 and 6, that gets then added into that kind of review of how this fits in with wider strategic objectives. On the right here is just an example of the analysis that Bedford did for one of their streets. And this is very simple. It just goes along the street and identifies all of the things that can be done, all of the issues and all of the options for improvements. And from that list, you can then start to list out your potential measures along a street. And a lot of the work that local authorities have been doing so far has been very simplistic like this. Costing is always a problem because one of the things that we're finding is this isn't really design, but it is identifying a series of measures. So we need to kind of make some fairly simplistic costing assumptions because we need that for getting on to stages 5 and 6. And so that's what unit cost you use is always going to be a bit of a problem, but most people have got previous schemes and previous work that they've done that will give them a ballpark idea. But one thing that is also coming out is that, particularly for walking and probably more so in many ways than for cycling, placemaking is a really important aspect. And I'm not personally convinced that at the moment the way we're using the walk route audit tool is really picking up that importance of the sort of emotional response that Becky talked about and the aesthetics of the route, and that it's really putting adequate value on that, because we know that making good places is probably the number one thing that will stimulate more walking. And I think just using the walking route audit tool as it stands, it's a very kind of engineering-led process, and it's not necessarily going to lead you towards placemaking as a solution. And that will very much come from the officers and the other stakeholders who are involved as to whether that is the way in which you start to go. Just finish, this is a case study from Pocklington. They were one of the first to sort of complete their walking and cycling infrastructure plan. And as you can see from the contents, that's fairly typical of the sort of contents that you would have in your completed LCWIP. Pocklington's obviously a small place, so it was a fairly simplistic process for them. There's a map of the area and a list of schemes and a programme. So that's really what the outputs start to look like. And that's me finished. So any further questions? So Emma, in terms of are we able to give advice on costing walking schemes and infrastructure? It's something that we've got on our list of things that we kind of need to start to accumulate. When the review of the cycling ambition projects was done, some costing advice came out of that on typical costs that people were using for their cycling schemes. We've done a number of schemes more recently that have looked at kind of neighbourhood planning, the kind of mini Holland livable neighbourhood type projects, and they are coming up with some typical schemes. So we'll try and collate those and get those onto Basecamp at some point. Yes, and Laura has just asked about the complexities of applying network analysis to larger cities. Again, it's something that it's ongoing at the moment. I'm working with TFGM on theirs. There are a number of other cities that are in the process of doing it as well. And everyone's doing it slightly differently, but they are roughly following that method that I looked at of kind of subdividing the city centre into smaller districts and then doing those links between them. So as more of that work is completed, we'll start to write that up as well.
Just going to hand over to Ashley now. So, right, having done this twice already, this should be really efficient. Right, let's just. Okay, so it's going to hand over to Ashley.
Hello, everybody. So I am going to talk through for a little bit about the walkability tool pilot. So this is something I developed at UCL, and I've been working with Becky at Living Streets to trial this. So the trial is still it's come more or less to the end of the trial now, but it was only done for 6 areas. So the trial was completed in Greater Manchester, Tees Valley, Liverpool City Region, Essex County Council, Leicester City Council, and Plymouth City. So I'm going to talk through that a little bit. Perfect. So the approach here is sort of building on the pre-existing walkability type analysis. In there, you generally try and quantify environmental attributes to assess the suitability of an area for walking, and to link this to walking activity, physical activity levels. How this sort of differs is it uses very detailed local data, and it's processed in a way to score the built environment down to practically street or subsections of the street level. The approach also, it attempts to be completely neutral in relation to the quality of the environment. There's no judgment of somewhere being a good or a bad pedestrian environment, and therefore places may score highly, which are really bad places to walk in, and may have a high score, or they may have a low score and actually be very pleasant pedestrian environments. The reason for doing this is to actually remove that variable from the sort of base analysis, so that places where you may actually have quite a lot of people walking, which are very bad pedestrian environments, are highlighted, and equally places which are very nice pedestrian environments but not many people are going to walk in because there's not many reasons to, won't come out, won't be highlighted in the analysis, because those aren't necessarily the most important spaces for pedestrian activity. And overall, the idea is to actually provide spatial planning insights for pedestrian network planning, zone identification, and as a general analytical evidence base to support policy objectives. And I will switch a little bit between walkability and pedestrian demand, because in this instance, they're synonymous with each other. So moving on, the actual walkability model itself. So there was quite a while ago, a long testing and evaluation phase, which was done in conjunction with TfL, using some of the data they have on pedestrian activity in London. And so after that process, 4 key variables came out of it. So street network accessibility, which is a network centrality measure, land use diversity, an entropy-based measure, public transport accessibility, a distance decay measure, and population density, a density measure, came as being the 4 most important components to construct the model. That then went through a testing phase. From that, we got weightings out of it, and then those 4 variables brought together into one combined estimation of pedestrian activity or functional walkability. And this has a final output. This was done for a small area of London, expanded it for London, and then did it to cover all the areas as part of the pilot. So I'm going to just talk about what was actually done on the pilot. So going into it being a pilot and not necessarily having a very clear idea of the exact analysis which would be most useful, eventually through a sort of iterative process, we came working with Becky and the local authorities which were part of the trial, came to the idea of identifying walking zones and walking networks so that it lines up nicely with the stage 4 requirements. And so I'm going to show a few examples of the outputs from that analysis. So you should be able to see Greater Manchester here. And so what this was these are the walking zones identified using the walkability analysis. And so here what we want to do is pull out the areas which have the highest potential pedestrian activity. These were classified according to the numerical distribution of the values that they achieved, and then we pulled out the ones which were the most sort of extreme above average. You should be able to see a red section there, which is Manchester city centre. And then 1 tier below that, there are green areas, which are the secondary walking zones. And then finally, you have the areas in blue, which are the tertiary walking zone. And these areas are still above average, but not going to be areas of very high activity compared to, say, the primary or secondary. And so you can see how this is presented. These are presented as contours here. The reason for doing that is because I think it's quite important to think about these things as happening over gradients. You don't have a boundary at which everything switches, and it's actually a gradual decay of activity in the street as movement disperses into the network around it. And I think that's quite useful when thinking about sort of the infrastructure planning, that you shouldn't have, that ideally you don't have hard edges to the infrastructure which is in place in different locations, and it kind of needs to cater to that gradient as much as possible. And then to give, I'm going to actually jump slightly. And so this is a clearer example. And then so that analysis I just showed, that was done at the whole regional level for the whole of Greater Manchester. And then also the analysis was done at the individual districts. So here we can see Stockport. And so here you can see more detail. And you can see here how you have the primary walking zone and sort of Stockport town centre, but then you actually have, and then around it you have a secondary walking zone, but then to the north you actually have a few patches of secondary walking zone as well. And I think the approach here picks up that nuance and the smaller sub-centres which may be located nearby, and gives a sort of understanding of how that all works together as one system, which I think is quite useful in thinking about the infrastructure that could go in. Jump slightly. And here's another example of the Tees Valley Combined Authority. Again, this is Combined Authority level analysis. And you can see here Hartlepool, Stockton and Darlington, as well as Middlesbrough, come out with these primary walking centres. Again, to jump down to the lower level of analysis, here you can see the actual sort of pedestrian demand spatial structure in Stockton, and you can see the town centre, but again to the north there are some sub-centres there, which again, when you're thinking about infrastructure, how that might work with that pre-existing structure, I think it's quite useful. So these are the walking zones, a few examples of the kind of analysis the pilot produced. And then the next stage of this was walking networks. So the walking networks, based on these walking zones, a few rules were sort of defined, which would then define the network which would serve those zones. The rules were all streets and paths that fell within the primary walking zone were classified as core walking network, where pedestrians should likely be given the primary importance as users of the space. Only the principal, most direct routes in and across secondary walking zones were classified also as core walking network. And then finally, within the tertiary walking zone, street network was only classified as part of the pedestrian network, and it was classified as linking network if it linked together either primary or secondary zones that were continuously connected by tertiary walking zones. That may be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to show some examples of that. So here you may struggle to see this slightly, but overlaid on the walking zones is walking network, and you can see blue, which is core, and then red, which is linking network. Here, this will be a lot clearer. So you can see here how all the street network in the primary walking zone is blue, and that is core walking network. The main routes in the main streets in the secondary walking zones are also core walking network. And then in red, you can see those links joining all that together across the tertiary walking zone. I think here also it's worth saying that the network is quite long in this example in Stockport. And I think here it's actually, you've got to think about how, say, the cycle network interplays with the walking network, and how some of those links should actually be maybe prioritized to other active modes and then feed into the walking network. And then just to show another example, so here again you can see in Stockton where you have the main town centre, and then you have those linking routes joining in the smaller sub-centres. And I think this is one thing that this analysis was probably particularly useful for, was picking up this sort of the nuances around the actual primary sort of town centre or area where the highest levels of walking, and how the networks can then work with that distribution of activity across the different locations. So this is so that those were the primary bits of analysis which completed. There was some other stuff looking also at the cycle networks and how they matched up or linked into one another. Another thing which came up quite a lot is thinking about future development plans, particularly housing, and how that would knit into these networks of active mode infrastructure. One point which sort of is thinking about how the transport network and the housing developments come together or don't come together in some instances, is maybe actually, whilst planning housing, actually think about, well, how can you build it into those networks, rather than possibly always thinking about how you can build housing and then extend networks to them, thinking about actually the planning process in the first place, and how do you actually plan for places which naturally encourage and promote active modes. Just plugging in areas into networks which may be quite a distance off won't necessarily immediately make people choose those modes. So it's about, thinking about all the broad evidence base about what kinds of places people naturally choose walking and cycling, because that's the most important thing, where it's a very low effort decision. And then finally, I'm just going to say something about prioritization, which also came up a lot. I think there's a lot of potential to use other data sources to understand where there's the most need for interventions, or where they should happen first and how they can be sequenced. I think once all the analysis that has been discussed by all of us has been done, I think then you can start looking at things like pedestrian injuries and fatality data to identify particular high-risk locations. Obviously, that needs to be in some way calibrated against a rate of both pedestrian activity and also against, vehicle numbers. Air quality is another factor which I think is quite important, and then also looking at deprivation indices and health outcomes to see where, if the focus would be on trying to get people to be more physically active through active travel, would be thinking about, where are you most likely to get the biggest return on an intervention in terms of getting potentially a small increase in physical activity, but that small increase being the most valuable. So that's sort of a quick rundown of the walkability tool pilot. And yes, if you have any questions, please fire them over via the text chat.
Well, good morning. I think it is still morning. In a darkened room here, it feels, you've no idea, sensory deprivation, no idea what it's like outside. Becky asked me to talk about, actually, I don't know if you have an agenda, I have one. It says topical walking infrastructure. And just some, I suppose, more innovative measures, stuff that's relatively new coming onto our plate as designers that we might want to know more about or have questions about. I have as many questions for my own stuff as I do about anybody else's. It's always good to keep talking and challenging. So I'm just going to be going through what I'm going through. My slide is moving on, but I shall do it through the medium of dance if we have to in a moment. There we are. So my starting point, in a sense, for a lot of stuff when we're talking about infrastructure for walking is why are we even talking about it? Why is it such a challenge, bearing in mind that everybody walks? And I often thought that actually I blame Monty Python, if any of you are old enough to remember that, which is there was a sketch called The Ministry of Silly Walks. And you can, in terms of the sort of tabloid hit list of non-jobs, just imagine if there was a minister for walking, and people will be asking you, what do you have next? The Ministry for Breathing. And the problem with walking is it's kind of hidden in plain sight. And I found this infographic recently, which I think is kind of shows the problem we got. At the top of it, you have your classic transport hierarchy, modal hierarchy, which virtually every transport policy statement in the land has, which is walking at the top and private cars very near the bottom. And then let's look at how we invest, shall we? Which is quite a challenge. I would also say something quickly about the this infographic. One is just the way that it describes walking as walking and cycling as cycling. You may be familiar with this, but I think I would always try and do that. We are talking about people walking, people cycling, people when they're in public transport, people in a taxi. And that the language of pedestrians, not just because it's such a pedestrian word, and of cyclists is deeply unhelpful. So actually I had quite a few of these sort of hierarchies, and I chose this one because it used those words walking and cycling. And that's what we're talking about, people walking today predominantly. There'll be some on people cycling as well. But I think that the challenge is, and especially when we get onto the costs, is the question's already been asked, how much does this cost, how much does that cost? We need to be, I think, I know it's easier said than done, but much more assertive about spending money on walking, not least because let's just have a look what's in our transport policies. It's the number one thing that should be a key to enabling better walking. Continuous footways is the thing I want to touch on first in terms of topical infrastructure. And it's this idea of basically, these are what we might do at side streets to enable people to walk across side streets much more easily than they can at the moment. Very often there's nothing on side streets. There might be full curbs, there might be drop, they may or may not have tactile paving, there may be raised crossings. But it'll be very clear through the language of design that this is a crossing of a carriageway, not a footway that motorists are crossing. And the idea of continuous footways, they've sometimes been dubbed Copenhagen crossings. They are, even for reasons I've yet really to understand, sometimes spoken of as blended crossings. It just gets away from the fact that what we are talking about here is running the footway continuously. And by continuous, I mean no concessions. So here's a photograph as was, back from Clapham Old Town. This was a scheme of ours. And you can see a narrow street there. It's a one-way out towards us. And it had drop curbs. There wasn't any tactile paving. You have about 15 times as many people walking across that junction as driving out of it in any given day. But the language is very much, it's a very minor crossing, in other words. The language is very much you're crossing a road. And the scheme was essentially this. We just ran footway across it. I'll show another angle, but there's no tactile paving there. There's no sense of there being a vehicle route through it. Vehicles, basically, drivers know they are crossing the footway. The language is unequivocal about that. Viewed from another angle, this is how it used to be. You can see no tactile paving, a little bit of raised, which helps a bit, but of course is confusing if you are blind or partially sighted and don't know how to deal with the flush edge, and we'll come on to that later. And that's kind of how it is now. It's actually a photograph taken just before it was finally commissioned, so it's a little bit ragged at the edges. Now, for me, what we're doing here is essentially designing for Highway Code Rule 170, and you may know there's a review of the Highway Code proposed at the moment, and it's this kind of thing is going to be very much part of that review, which is how do we deal with pedestrian and vehicle priorities at sort of minor locations. Touch on that a little bit in a moment. And essentially pedestrians should have priority here, kind of almost like morally, but actually in terms of the Highway Code, they do as well. It's just a footway. We shouldn't have to show where it stops and ends, but that's easier said than done. So here's a photograph of me 4.5 years ago, because the scheme's been in now for 4 years, completely open. With a couple of people on the left, one of whom was from Living Streets, one of whom was a local councillor, and the woman with the Sainsbury's bag is a woman called Tamara, who had phoned up. And good, and credit to her for basically digging around, found out who Living Streets were, and basically said, "I'm a bit concerned about this." And if I can go quickly back to my photograph, this could almost be her walking with her children. She walked down here every day to go to school with them, and they scoot ahead and then they stop at the edge of the carriageway because that's safe, right? And her concern was, she wasn't shouting or angry, just thought, but hang on, but they don't know where to stop. And we said, well, that's okay, they don't have to because the motorists will stop. And Tamara's question was, but will they? To which our response was, with our fingers crossed behind our back, saying, yes, we trust they will. And that's one of the challenges for us, I think, which is, in that circumstance, with a layout that is not commonplace, although it is commonplace on the continent, will drivers, will people get the message? Will the street be self-explaining? Our view was, it will be, because it's so obviously a footway. As I said, no concessions at all. The yellow lines don't run through. There's no tactile edge to imply that there's a crossing there. This is a proper footway. For example, just like when you're crossing from the carriageway to your driveway, the drivers will read as, well, I'm crossing a footway here. all I can say, there were 5 junctions we designed in this way in Clapham, Old Town. They've been operational now for over 4 years. The safety record is unblemished, in fact, slightly better. No problems whatsoever at the junctions themselves. And we're in touch still with Nigel here, the councillor on the left. No anecdotal evidence either that people are finding this difficult. So, it's something that really gives us encouragement. Transport for London have been doing some sort of more objective research of these studies, of this kind of layout. It's not yet published yet. And it's showing that, of course, while drivers don't always stop and just wait forever for people to cross, it's nevertheless there are no issues actually encountered, no collisions reported, and to be honest, better than the existing circumstances where you have raised crossings and stuff like that. Although unfortunately, TfLs isn't a comparative study, so there's no control. And there's sort of the end state of how it is today. Vehicles coming out. I've taken quite a bit of video there. It's just basically drivers read it, and some are a little bit more respectful for others, but it's really establishes very clear priority for walking, which people on feet are using. And this was a great little anecdote that we had, and one of the things I kind of like, and it comes back to this idea of walking being hidden in plain sight, I think, which is this person just saying, "Yeah, I knew it was better. I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't put my finger on it." It's only when we found out there was a scheme. And I think this is one of the things for us. If we do our job really well, people may not thank us for it. Life just gets better in a way that's very ordinary. And yet the challenge can be to do this ordinary stuff, because people on foot themselves, I'll touch on this later, are a little bit nervous because I don't know where I am. I don't know where my edge is. And we're so unused, we're so used, notwithstanding our modal hierarchy, we are so unused as people when we walk to basically doffing our cap to virtually every other mode around, that it can be really quite challenging to get infrastructure that is obviously for the benefit of walking to get out there. So we just need to keep looking, seeing what others have done and trying to learn by it and thinking for ourselves. Here's another arrangement you can see it's a cycle track. This is on Leith Walk in Edinburgh. I'll probably touch on the cycling aspect in a little moment related to that. It's good that they've done this. You can see that the middle field is another one-way street, and I think these arrangements work particularly well with one-way streets, obviously relatively quiet ones. But I do have an issue with the fact you can see the red lines wrapping round. Really, they should be continuous and just straight along the curbside. Again, it's implying there more than the design itself does, that there's a vehicle route through here. It gives a little bit perhaps more natural encouragement to drivers just to run across. Viewed from the other side, you can see, it's okay having the lines here. They should just stop where they do there. And on the other side, as I say, just parallel to the curb all the way around rather than dipping in. But it's a very simple arrangement, again, alongside a cycle track. This is down in Lambeth, McGee Street, alongside one of the cycle superhighways. I keep forgetting their names. Just there we are. The footway just goes straight through. And there's been quite a few surveys here. You can see it's a proper giveaway line, and motorists do give way. Obviously, what might then happen is they come through and sit. They can't get out. They might sit in the carriageway or in the cycleway or the footpath for a little while they're making their kind of final move onto the carriageway. But it's safe unless you actually actively bump into the car. But obviously, the car is moving very slowly or static if it's in that realm. Just a couple of other examples to show. This is one from Barcelona, a very simple arrangement. Although interestingly enough, you might be able to just see on the left side there, they have a flashing amber signal. It's not actually a signalized junction, but they took the view when installing this just to make it clear. But the language itself is very clear. You've got quite an obvious bump up. There's no obvious edge, and that seemed to work very well. This kind of thing. This is from the Amsterdam, but arrangements like this in the Netherlands and in Denmark are really very common. And obviously there's an issue there, which is they are common, and therefore drivers are much more familiar with them. And when we're moving, I think one of the real challenges for us, because there's a real game change that we need, comes back to my original point, I think, about walking infrastructure. It has been predicated for the most part on just making it work in the context of motor traffic being the dominant mode. And when we're trying to change that game, there's this kind of, will it work? And it is quite cultural change. There are one or two legal and sort of civil differences between the landscape, regulatory landscape, as it were, in most countries and ours. So, for example, drivers are obliged to stop here rather than reading the language to stop. But nevertheless, we can see that these arrangements can work. And so the challenge for us is to get there by, to do a thing where perhaps in the easiest locations, really quiet side streets, and then perhaps think a little bit further up. Perhaps you might have questions about, well, how quiet is quiet? And we can talk about that later. It's obviously a real issue. This won't be an appropriate layout in many busier locations. In Waltham Forest, as part of their Mini Holland, they've tried similar arrangements. This is their version. Not too sure about this in certain respects, quite good, but actually because it almost looks too fat for the footway, it has the air being, in some of the locations, some of them are much tighter, of being kind of a rather more vague public space rather than very clearly a linear footway across the junction. Further down in Waltham Forest, the same arrangement here. You can see the cycle track here, and then the arrangement which was kind of very wide, and which is one of the reasons why they have those planters there to try and focus motor traffic in the middle, because otherwise they could easily take the corner. You see that arrangement there. But coming back to my final slide, so this is one of many, many alleys in Glasgow that you encounter. And if you can see, it's basically, there's only bins and rats down there. There is actually a little car park behind, but there's another entrance to it. At the best, this would only in any case carry a tiny number of vehicles. But if you cannot deal with curbs, you are trapped by this. And so what's been delightful, partly because it's near the office we work, and even though this is not part of directly part of one of the projects we're working at, they did this recently. And you just think, how difficult is that? Let's start with the really easy stuff, okay? And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in our towns and cities, far more than there should be. And actually, when we look around, the work we're doing in Glasgow is a major investment program, which is great. But if you're familiar with the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule, there really certainly is an extent to which if we just went and healed all our obvious howlers, we'd be making things for walking so much better. And then costs, kind of, right? That costs you the price of a lunch to do that. It's just a maintenance scheme. This is not something we should be worrying about, how much it costs relative to how much we spend on other stuff. Cheap as chips. And also, these things aren't, crazy new stuff. I have a sadly huge library of street things, and this is a thing that's been in there for as long as I've known it, since the 80s, late 80s, early 90s in Sheffield, and possibly before that. This is one down in Thornton Heath and towards Croydon. You can see Chesil Close. It's quite a quiet street, but this idea of just nothing at all, just run across the giveaway line over there. And there's some street view from a friend of mine who said, oh, there's one up in Lancaster. I like the idea of Dale Street. If it was Dale's Street, that would be even better. And I don't want to talk about the bollards, but it's just, there was one there. This is not crazy new stuff. We don't have much of it. But it's almost like because we start doing new stuff, familiar stuff hidden in plain sight. It's interesting. So part of that, as part of this, how do we make, and especially on the expense side of things, that was a very cheap thing I showed you in Glasgow, stuff in Clapham, Old Town. It sort of depends, because obviously if you're going to complete reconstruction of that area there, it depends what's underneath. Possibly you have to construct the footway quite well, obviously, because you're anticipating quite a lot of vehicle overruns, because that's the point, vehicles crossing. And we may be talking, one junction, another, 10, 15,000. We might. It really depends. It could be cheaper than that. It depends how big the junction, how much you're covering. And they're proper construction projects. On the other hand, and I'll come on to this idea of hashtag turning the corner at the moment, there are things we can do much more cheaply. And this is a bunch of people. Unfortunately, the photo doesn't quite show it. This is on essentially a side street crossing the main road. The main street is where the photographs are taken, really. And there's Chris Boardman, the cycling walking commissioner up in Manchester, walking with his assistant Martin Key behind him, my colleague Brian Deegan behind him, and Kirsty behind them. And it's that idea of you can just do this. You can get some paint out and you can do that really quickly. Visual priority is very clear. And you don't have to construct anything. You need a couple of cans of thermoplastic paint and you're good. The problem about it is you can't do them, right? And that's not a zebra. It doesn't have any zigzags. It's not got any Felicia beacons. It's like the language is really quite clear, but we technically can't do them. And Manchester and DFT are in discussions almost as we speak on that. And yet it's not entirely new. Brian Deegan, I say my colleague, just happened to have to go to the hospital in Luton the other day, and boom, there you go. Goodness knows. And of course, there are real issues here about, should something happen, which is, I think, the department's concern, should something happen, it's not clear. Pedestrians might have been suckered into, let's forget about the fact there's no tactile paving in the example we're showing here, but have pedestrians been suckered into crossing, and because it's not proper zebra, motorists who would turn across would say, well, and there's confusion there, and therefore risk and obvious concern. My take on that is actually sometimes it's us as designers, in that case Manchester, a lot of stuff's happened in London recently, which is we should nevertheless be trying to push. As I'm sure you know, in TSR-GD 2016, which wasn't in the previous one, you can now have much less formal zebras to cross cycle tracks at floating bus stops. We'll come on to that quickly. Maybe we should push for this kind of thing, because what this enables us to do is to establish clear priority really cheaply, really quickly. And it's not really necessarily a matter of cost. If you wanted to reconstruct that footway, maybe that'll cost you £5,000, £10,000, I don't know, right? But it also just takes time and disruption. So we'll see. The turning the corner thing I showed beforehand is just part of a campaign that British Cycling has started and that Living Streets and others have got involved with. And is going to be part of this highway code review, can we just big up, as it were, the priority to cycling and walking across side streets? As I said, highway code rule 170 applies, rule 206 probably applies in different ways, but they're slightly vague, and they are highway code rules, which doesn't make them law. And so motorists should give way, certainly if you're established, but our experience, isn't it, is that we're crossing a road, even, often possibly because it's a bit of a bell mouth, so it's much further across than it should be, because of the bell mouth, it allows much higher vehicle approach speeds. And because of that, we can have started walking, the vehicle actually was nowhere near us, can start swinging across, and we might easily get tooted at, because in practice, nobody knows about highway code rule 170. You're in my carriageway, get out of the way. But perhaps something like this is a way of dealing with that much more quickly. I've mentioned already this idea of cycling at bus stops, and of course, although we are focusing on walking today, the issue about walking in the context of cycle tracks at bus stops is quite a challenging one. And I don't know if you've come across this one, but certainly blind and partially sighted lobby groups, I've heard this quite on occasion, which is these bus stops are now a no-go area for us. And the thing is, they're really not. But we have to respect the view, even if it's a campaigning thing and it's a little bit going over the top to say these are no-go areas, which is we have to engage with. Why might people who are blind and partially even go as far as saying that? And we do have to engage with those issues. There's a real danger, I think, in our world that we can sort of go, oh, come on, and ignore it and think, well, actually, what is a subjective? It's not normally a subjective concern. And we can't just say, oh, they've done it for years in other countries and here. And besides, here's one from somewhere back in the day. We've had these things before. Just get over yourselves. We can't really do that. We need to engage and then think about what we're going to do about it. We started this point to deal with the Equality Act. And I think it's important just to touch on this here. We'll talk about it a little bit in a moment. And one of the great things about the Equality Act is if people have a protected characteristic, as people who are blind and partially sighted do, the Equality Act allows, firstly, for the fact that there is no single right answer, that things are messy. Things are often especially messy in cities and in city streets where things are incredibly complex. We're trying to achieve so much, and so many different people need and want so much from it at different times of the day and so forth. But specifically, in order to help us deal with this uncertainty and complexity, what the Equality Act does is allow us to do stuff which which may be challenging for some people with protected characteristics. But if what we are trying to do is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, it's phrase is used quite a few times in the Quality Act, it's very important for us. Is it a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim? And I think actually in the context of cycling bus stops and walking to get bus stops, and in the context of concerns from blind and partially sighted people, it's really worth looking at this. Our legitimate aim is to enable more people cycling. It's a policy aim, it's there all as well. That is a clearly established legitimate aim. What else do we know? Well, we know that research shows that if we are to achieve that aim, people will only cycle more when they feel it's safe to do so. In busy streets, people will only feel it's safe to cycle if they're protected from that traffic. We know that stuff. The problem is, if we do that, the simple fact is when our protected cycle lanes, which you have to do, right? When they get to bus stops, we have a challenge. And it's a challenge we can only meet in one of three ways. And one of the ways of dealing with it is we could terminate the protected cycle lane and ask cyclists to go back into the general traffic, which fundamentally undermines the investment in the whole the rest of the cycle track. The cycle track, it protected the cycle track, we're going to break it every 400 or 500 meters from bus. So we're really not going to do that, right? So that's one way we could deal with, but it undermines our investment. The second thing is to run the cycle lane frankly in front of the bus stop. We call that a bus board arrangement. I'll show some photographs, or we run it behind, and that's what we could tend to call floating bus stop arrangements. And with either 2 or 3, we do have a challenge, especially for people at blind and partially sighted, for interactions between walking and cycling. We've got to try and deal with that. And there are different ways of doing it. You can basically have nothing. You can have some kind of vaguely marked crossing of the cycle track, cycle path. We could have an informal zebra, or actually now a formal zebra. We could have slow markings and other stuff. We could use features to encourage cyclists to slow down, ribs and stuff like that. And we could possibly also narrow the cycle path at the point of crossing behind the bus stops. With the best will in the world, even with a high level of cycling service, you don't particularly want, I think, be encouraging cyclists to one person on a cycle to think they can overtake another in a contested arrangement like this. So you could narrow it down. Here's an old bus border arrangement. Here's the the cycle track in front of a bus stop on Royal College Street in Camden, as was. And this was there for years. It's quite, to be honest, and these are the things we need to consider. It's a not very frequent bus service, about 5 an hour, and it's not a very well-used bus stop. So it's not doesn't tend to be crowded. But this was particularly confusing, bearing in mind, as you may be able to see, this was a bi-directional cycle track at this point. So people could be coming from both sides. Royal College Street was kind of redone. And this is how that bus stop looks now. Sorry, one further down there a bit. It was redone because of the bi-directional track was confusing to people, and actually there were quite a few collisions with motorists and cyclists. So it's now just one direction, and people board and alight the bus from the cycle track. And of course, that will be a real problem, won't it? Because cyclists will just barrel through and knock everybody down. Well, you know, most people on bikes are just people, and they're fairly reasonable. And we did some video surveys and found, like these 2 people here, is when people were crossing, this took a long time actually for the people to get off this bus. There's a buggy, and I think there might have been a wheelchair. These people on bikes just stopped because they're like, that's what you do. And we observe that actually quite often people on cycles don't necessarily stop exactly like that. You know, if they take a judgment that it's just one person they have to get past, they might just slow down a bit, go to one side a bit, all that kind of thing. But these arrangements can work. And here's a recent one up in Enfield that's been done. Very clear that, you know, this is a boarding area. There's obviously a ramp in this location as well here, which just helps to give a good signal to people on bikes that actually, you know, you need to give way, you know, give some thought to that when the bus is stopped. A different arrangement, one that we did down in Brighton many years ago now, where essentially what you've got a footway and a cycle track, and at this point it's formally a shared area, but the language is clear. So again, this is a circumstance where it's not a very frequent bus service and not many people use that bus stop. In terms of floating bus stops going around the behind, well, this is one from Bracknell, you know, Newtown, and it's this idea of actually, you know, we've been doing this for quite a while. Obviously that's a single path, it's a shared walking cycling path behind that bus stop. There's an ancient one up in Walthamstow that's been there for a kind of long time. Interesting way of articulating it. These things have happened. Here's a brand new one down on Blackfriars Road near the TfL office at Palestra. And that's got a zebra which has also got balises. It hasn't got any zigzags, doesn't actually have to have the balises. TfL at the moment is just looking for their own purposes to see what's there. Now, it's a pretty generous arrangement, and what's really clear here essentially is that to get to the bus stop, which is generously laid out itself, you're going to have to cross essentially a carriageway. It just is only a cycle carriageway, and you can see there's tactile paving there and stuff like that. I'll come on to that in a moment generally, but that's an arrangement, a much narrower arrangement. This is one, again in London, down on Lambeth Palace Road. There's less room there, and you can see the cycling in the carriageway. It connects with something else. But you can't quite see, but there's a raised crossing there where the zebra is. That is the zebra again. No tactiles no zigzags and no balises. Here's one that's been in Lewis Road in Brighton for 5 years now at least. And here's a relatively new one in Manchester, and you can see some of the things they put in there. These are slightly raised ribs, and there's giveaway markings there for pedestrians. It says look out for cycles. And this is something I would say is, basically put the belt and braces on when you're doing something the first time. This is a general point. You'd like to think that perhaps one of these days, if we're doing floating bus stops, you wouldn't need all of this, but to help people who are walking, who are nervous about this arrangement, just frankly, I'm comfortable with the idea of throw everything at it at the moment, rather than trying to go minimalist and finding that there are concerns from people walking about these arrangements, especially, and then you find that there's an uproar and you don't get to do any more. Further down that same road, the Oxford Road, that was in Manchester, this is the Wilmslow Road, a previous generation, and this touches on something that, to be honest, it's a much narrower street, it's a much busier ordinary high street. It touches on something Becky was saying earlier about the fact that I don't know for sure here, but some of this space I think has been taken, some of the space has been taken for walk. And I don't know if to be honest, I don't know this well enough, but there could be some challenges with that, and there often are. Certainly there is in this location on Leith Walk in Edinburgh, where this is pretty narrow stuff. This is very busy. It's kind of new. It's our first stab at this, and there's a sense of learning. I don't know if one of the things I just want to touch upon here is that you see this sort of some tactile arrangement there, but you've got this rib tactile on one side of where the pedestrians will cross to get to, sort of corduroy tactile, nothing on the other side. The other side of that, you've got corduroy tactile and this dark blister paving on one side. And then going back to the other side of the road, you can see here with this child, and that's kind of showing, well, this is why we want to do stuff like this. But so that's a good reason, but it still is difficult sometimes to do it right. But if you look at the tactile arrangement with that little zebra there, it's dark, but it didn't used to be there. And they changed the blister paving. So there's an issues of consistency, but there's also issues of just learning. I'll skip through this. This is just some stuff in Glasgow, but we're running a bit short of time. That's actually getting built at the moment. So spoke about tactile basics, and this is something for all of us. Really, I think one of the real challenges with tactile pavement provision, it's rubbish, right? Wherever you go, there's so little consistency was the most important point. Now, my personal view is that I know the DFT is looking at a possible review of the tactile paving guidance. It's 20 years old. It's 84, large print, over 100 pages big. It is nonsensically large and complicated for something that's actually so simple. And I think because the clarity of, if you look for really early on when it talks about blister paving is to mark where there's essentially a flush edge, calls it greater than 25 mil, where people who are blind and partially sighted won't know that they're walking off the footway into the carriageway. If we just focused on that, it's really easy to get right. In Glasgow, this has just been redone at one junction. There's nothing. That's flush. There's nothing at all. I think, how did that happen? Next junction along, part of a new scheme. There is something, but it's completely different one side of the street from the other. And if you can see to the far side of that picture, you can see the tactile paving covers part of where it's flush, but not all of it. Next junction down, again, another arrangement. I was just in Eltham the other day in southeast London, a bit of tactile paving, not covering all of it. One colour, the other side it's smaller, a different colour, and doesn't cover all of it. And I'm deeply sad about this now, but basically if you just walk around and look at tactile provision wherever you are, it will be like this, horribly inconsistent. And I think one of the things that we can do and should do is let's just keep it really simple. You've got a flush edge, you give it a tactile signal. Do you want to put blister on the main pot crossing point? That's fine. But you do need also to put corduroy, let's say, on the bits where you're not anticipating people, that's not the main crossing line, but they need a signal. Just in Hackney as well, just a thing the other day, you can see a crossing point at the top of the picture there. This thing here with the, I think that's almost guidance path tactile paving, is for a side, very quiet, actually cycle only side street, looking the other way. Again, it's all flush, but there's some not. It's a real mess. We can ourselves, as we focus on the simple things, do much better. Guard railings, don't make me laugh. We call them guard railings. They're really pedestrian coercion railings. Let's be honest about that. The idea is we're protecting pedestrians, but normally it's basically to make pedestrians cross where our junction traffic models say that they should, or a very easy thing to throw in because it's dirt cheap. If someone has got knocked down and the council needs to be seen to do something. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Local Transport Note 209 essentially showed what we kind of could have known, which is we've been doing this for years, but we don't really know if it has a positive safety effect. And this transport note showed that actually site for site, sites with, sites without, had more or less identical safety records. And the problem about guard railing is that people will still do stuff. It's kind of, this is what I'm saying, is we don't want you to cross here. We think it's not safe for you to cross. So we sometimes put up guard railing, or have done. It's not terribly commonplace these days, which is good. But people will still go where they want to go. So we need to have a bigger solution rather than just try to stop them when we can't. Here's a family, including somebody carrying their child on a dual carriageway. Here's some people that's been changed now in Aldgate. We trap people on the wrong side. People will not be coerced. And even on, this is Great Charles Queensway in Birmingham, big dual carriageway and really, really big guardrail in the middle of the 3-lane dual carriageway. People will still do this. We've got to do better than that. My favourite example is this thing we did for, this used to be Mare Street in Hackney, and we were asked by, this is almost 10 years ago, asked for them to look at, we don't want guardrail, and we went through the whole of Mare Street, and we've developed a method for them, which is actually, you can find in the Manual for Streets 2, which is basically a rational decision-making process, which is, forget about what guardrailing you've got, think about, would we put this in, and would it have a safety effect? There's a lot of guardrail in Mare Street. This had no effect. There's basically a crossing off to the right here past the blue lorry, but people would just basically drop out. You can see where that Mercedes is coming out. They drop out of the gap here and just walk across the junction anyway. And we basically said, look, almost all the guard railing in Mare Street is having no positive safety effect. So bless them, they took it away, almost all of it. In 28 months before they did anything else, the pedestrian collision record improved. Now, we were just saying, actually, we don't think that guard railing is helping safety. It seemed to improve matters. And our only view on that is probably that actually people walking, people in cars kind of understood that the guard railing wasn't helping or protecting, so they just looked a bit better, looked a bit more. And then what was wonderful is that a couple of years later, he came along and did the right thing, which is let's get that signalised crossing bang on the desire line. So that's a good example. I'll skip over that. But it's great. Costs, I mentioned that. Here's Tom Cruise and Jerry Maguire. And there's always this thing about show me the money. And I would just sort of say that almost nothing I've spoken about. Getting rid of the guard railing, all you need is a couple of mates a weekend, a couple of pints and an angle grinder. You know, doing the other stuff, maybe some of your posh reconstruction footways can cost you this. Dobbing in some paint costs virtually nothing. If you're doing it as part of a cycling scheme, it's just a matter of thinking about it as part of that bigger scheme rather than not thinking about it. Putting in good tactile paving, good provision there, cheap as chips. It's not an issue. And when we go back to this, it's obvious, right? We shouldn't be scrabbling around. And I know we sometimes are, but it should be easy to make the case for cheap, effective walking infrastructure. I just wanted to finish finally on shared space, partly because it's a controversial thing at the moment. That's why I call it so-called and put it in quotes. And the fact that it's become a thing, even though nobody can define it, is a real challenge for us. Right at the moment, as you probably know, we're in a situation where there's a sort of pause. Local authorities have been asked in England to be asked to pause the use of the deployment of shared space, which of course is a bit of a challenge because no one has defined what it is. So here's some things for me worth bearing in mind is back in the day, 15 years or so ago, we started trying to create more people-friendly streets. when we started doing things like removing curb definition and that kind of thing, understandably, there was growing concern from blind and partially sighted people that they would be excluded from this. So that's out there. We tried to make things friendlier, and some of the techniques we used were concerned some people for good reason. Jumping forward a bit, it took a long time, but the House of Commons and Women's and Equalities Committee last year issued a report, which I'll touch on in a moment. Responding to that, the government in early this year said, thank you very much. There was a call for a moratorium by the WEC on shared space. And the government here said, well, actually, we're not going to tell anybody that they shouldn't do it. But we do want people to exercise their duties responsibly. And besides, actually, this applies to all street design, not just to so-called shared space, which is poorly defined and less poorly understood or commonly understood. But then after that, in March, there was a letter from the Disability Minister to the Department for Transport saying, actually, I think you should try harder. This resulted because Sarah Newton had been lobbied by blind and partially sighted groups. And the trying harder was expressed in the Inclusive Transport Strategy that came out in July, and a follow-up letter from Nusrat Ghani, which basically said, there's no moratorium, but we would ask you to pause. It's only a request, but you will comply with this request, won't you? Unfortunately, that wasn't clear, A, about what shared space is, but also about where it applies. And there was a lot of nervousness about, does this apply to new housing developments, when really the focus has always tended to be on high streets and stuff like that. So there was a clarification letter saying, look, it doesn't apply to new housing developments. And then Scottish ministers to Scottish local authorities wrote another letter themselves in the light of all that, which I'll quickly touch on. The key thing for me is the WEP report says this, when it's talking about shared space, it says, in particular, we want you to instruct local authorities that controlled crossings and regular height curbs are to be retained. And this is the issue. Forget shared space. We are talking about certainty of crossing and certainty of knowing when I'm moving from a safe space, the footway, to a dangerous space, carriageway. If only we could focus on that, rather than talking about this thing called shared space, we'd be so much better off. And the letter from Scotland didn't really talk about, there's no moratorium. It just said this, look, we expect you to do your street design right, to exercise your public sector quality duty, talk to people, take into account their concerns in your design, and if necessary, take it into account. You can go with it, but you may not be able to achieve it. So for us, where are we at now in the light of this pause? First of all, you need to focus on your design outcomes, not on design jargon. We're not trying to do shared space, we're trying to achieve some things. If you don't know what your design outcomes are, in any case, you won't be able to claim proportionate means, because you won't know whether you have a legitimate aim, which is your outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? And therefore, why might the thing you would be doing something you can do, even though it doesn't work best for some people? So focus on these key issues of edge definition and certainty of crossing, engage, listen, process, and respond, take it into account, and basically keep designing streets to make walking safer, more convenient, more attractive, and the natural choice for all short trips. And my final thing on this is, just quickly go through this stuff, is one of the issues for blind and partially sighted people when they're walking in this context is, what they're asking essentially is, just keep me safe. And what we're trying to do with these design things is, as pedestrians, to think, but I'm in charge here. It goes all the way back to the continuous footways as well. This is brilliant. You just get to walk straight across. I'm nervous. I don't know where the edge is. I understand that. But what it is our job to try and do, I think, is to make walking so much more simple and natural. To talk about a whole new world for walking, where it's not just we have permission to walk and we're told where we should walk and where we can be kept safe. I'm not a big fan of Aladdin, where that song Whole New World came on, but I love this photograph, which I took on the scheme we did in Camden a few years ago. This is what we are talking about in our towns and cities, where walking is actually at the top. That is a whole new world, and there's much we can do to try and achieve it. I need to stop. Sorry.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, I just want to thank my fellow panelists and presenters for adding so much interesting detail to this webinar. I hope it's been useful. We have run over time a little bit. If anybody does, we've probably got about 5 minutes more. If anybody does want to ask a couple of questions, we can probably take one or two I've still got Adrian and John here. If not, Basecamp is the place to continue all these discussions. I hope this has started some interesting topics that we might take forward on there. And yeah, anything else, I think you've really got access to the strategic support through the LCWIP programme as well, which can hopefully advise further on some things. So let me just see whether we've got any. Yeah, so the slides will be, yeah, hopefully, as long as this is recorded properly. I know there was an issue with the first webinar, but I did check out all of the recordings, so I really hope this is recorded properly, and we'll get that onto Basecamp, or in an accessible format that more of you are able to watch, because I know some people haven't been able to access Zoom. Yeah, I think it's probably lunchtime, so I appreciate that we've kept you here for a little bit longer. So yeah, we will try and share the presentations as a video as well. Yeah, okay, if there's no further questions at the moment, then I'm going to sign off. Thanks again to John and Adrian and Ashley for joining me this morning, and yeah, I hope to touch base with a few more of you on Basecamp. Thanks.